a previous book a few years ago that was on the Apostle Paul, and in particular his Christology, his way of understanding Jesus, interpreting Jesus, in which I had a long look at Jewish Messianism as a context for Paul's beliefs about Jesus, and did a bit in that book of commenting on what it is we mean to talk when we talk about messiahs in ancient Jewish and Christian texts. And having written that book, then my head was very much in this field of research. I had become familiar with a lot of literature on it. I had some dissatisfactions with sort of received ways of talking about it, some suspicions about what I thought might be a better way of talking about it, and inspiration from a few recent scholars who had made what I thought were really trenchant comments about how to think about Messianism, but for the most part, they did so in sort of brief and allusive ways. People like John Collins and Lauren Stuckenbrook and Annette Reed and Martha Himmelfarb. So I had sort of the seeds of an idea, and so then I went away and spent a lot more time looking at this material, both familiarizing myself with the modern literature on it, because there's an enormous 19th and especially early 20th century scholarly literature on Messianism in the ancient world. It was one of those classic kinds of books, that if you were a Victorian or World War I era scholar of the Bible, whether Hebrew Bible or New Testament, a number of rabbinic scholars as well, it's sort of you prove your mettle by writing a book on this topic. So there's a lot of modern discussion on it that operated on lots of shared assumptions that that nowadays, sort of ideologically and philosophically, most of us working in this field would find untenable. And yet I found that lots of contemporary writers on Messianism were actually still operating with the received categories from a lot of this Victorian and later scholarship. So especially there was a thoroughgoing indebtedness to 19th century German metaphysical idealism that is a way of thinking about what we're seeing in these ancient texts, and that it is, not ancient people, ancient actors making interpretations of their circumstances and of their holy books and received traditions, but that there's actually there's an idea above and behind and bigger than all of these texts and actors, and it is imposing itself on them, which is a certain very influential philosophical way of thinking about history in the mid-19th century especially, that in this particular subfield, it seemed to me, scholars were still, often unwittingly maybe, deeply wedded to. So what I was trying to do was to see if one could think through Messianism in antiquity, systematically trying to shed a lot of that inheritance, and starting instead sort of from working from the text up rather than from stipulating an idea and then working down, going and finding it. So it was I suppose all scholarly projects are like this, in the sense that we're in a dialogue with our bibliographical predecessors with secondary literature. But this project was in a very particular way. I felt like I was living very close to these Heinrich Gretz and Joseph Klausner and Emil Schurer and Gershom Scholem and Sigmund Mowinckel and all these sort of towering scholars of previous generations who were enormously learned and made really remarkably helpful comments about lots of these particular texts, but that who also had grand syntheses that I think were just deeply unpersuasive. And yet it seemed to me in this area, those of us working nowadays hadn't come around in a fulsome way to actually theorizing this problem differently. And so that was that was what launched my my effort into the project. The book treats a lot of ancient texts over a really broad swath. I mean, it starts in kind of the starts in the Persian period, basically. So, you know, relatively late Hebrew Bible material, and then it goes all the way up into the Byzantine period. And sort of the latest texts I'm looking at are some patristic, but especially rabbinic texts. I mean, from the Babylonian Talmud is sort of the end point. So I say it's sort of from second Isaiah to the Babylonian Talmud is more or less the breadth that's covered. And I look at an enormous number of texts in there that talk about messiahs in so many words. So that means texts that are now part of our Hebrew Bible, lots of so-called Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, Dead Sea Scrolls, Philo, Flavius Josephus, lots of New Testament texts, second century apologists like Justin Martyr, heresiologists like Irenaeus, the Mishnah, the Palestinian and Babylonian Talmuds. So an enormous number of texts in which I intervene in lots of the discussions relevant to those texts. So there are lots of particular judgments that scholars who worked on those texts will agree or disagree with. So I mean, I take lots of particular views that are not terribly idiosyncratic necessarily, but lots of these things are contested. So I mean, I argue that that there probably was an uninterpolated form of the Testimonium Flavianum in Josephus' Antiquities. I argue that the vision of Gabriel stone is probably not evidence for a Messiah son of Joseph or a Messiah son of Ephraim already sort of before the fall of the temple. I argue that there's no good evidence that that Bar Kokhba, the second century Jewish Messiah figure, had any claim to Davidic ancestry, but that in the case of Jesus, the evidence is more mixed on that count. There's lots of these particular textual judgments that will be contested by people who looked at these texts. But the main thing about the book, the main claim that I expect to be controversial is the beginning point and the central claim, and that is that it's at least equally, probably more worthwhile or profitable to use the word Messiah to track with particular uses of ancient words, rather than to define it in our own terms and then measure ancient texts against it. So I know this is controversial because I've presented a lot of this research at conferences and seminars here or there, and it's more than a couple of times I'll get a question to the effect that someone hearing my argument will say, I think you're saying Messiah, but you don't mean Messiah. You mean something like anointed. But because Messiah, we all know, really means an eschatological Superman. And my point is, well, no, we don't know that. I mean, we stipulate that, but that's a preoccupation of our own, actually. So inasmuch as Messiah is just our transliteration for a perfectly useful ancient word, then we actually we make the task more difficult for ourselves by carrying this really loaded modern definition for it, and then going in and screening texts in or out, depending how satisfactory they are to us relative to that definition. So, I mean, that's the core idea behind the book, and that's the thing that's most likely to sit awkwardly with people. So I hope that readers will stick with it, follow the argument through, and then I think maybe come to see that there's a lot to be gained if you can bracket out some of those modern preoccupations and try to follow the game that the texts themselves are playing. I hope that, and I think it's reasonable to think that it'll make contributions to lots of the particular areas that it addresses, but those are a lot. I mean, it matters for so the study of Jewish literary production in antiquity, the ways that texts that we think of now as scripture or other sort of related texts, how they came about, how they related to one another, how they influence their own successors. That's one big area, but then lots of particular corpora. I mean, I hope the book would make its own kind of contribution to people who are interested in this slice of the Dead Sea Scrolls, or the the canonical Gospels, or the second century heresiologists, or the study of the Mishnah, the study of Philo. There are whole sections of the book that are largely devoted to the question of the Messiah in each of these corpora. So I would hope that people who are seriously expert in each of those areas would find my arguments persuasive and I hope useful. It also, though this book is it's a more programmatic kind of book even than some other academic monographs, in that it's not just trying to do one particular task, but more than that, it's trying to point the way toward a research program, to say that previous ways of talking about messianism that we've all taken on board have maybe gotten us just about as far as they reasonably can, and that a quite different set of questions potentially opens up lots of new interesting avenues for research. So with this book, actually, I hope that it'll make a contribution in terms of teeing up other people to chase down new connections between texts that previously have deliberately not been brought together because of presuppositions on the part of scholars about what is allowed to count as messianic. And I hope that by reshuffling the deck and allowing lots of evidence in that has been sort of cast aside previously, that this book would set up new and interesting work in lots of those particular subfields. So it's very much, as a book, it's not the kind of thing that's meant to be a last word, but hopefully as a first word for a number of now different kinds of explorations in this area.